I never thought a single sandwich would change the direction of two lives. But that afternoon in Chicago proved how small moments can carry the weight of something far bigger than anyone can see at first glance. Rain pressed gently against the glass windows of a small corner deli on West Madison Street, the kind of place where the bell above the door rings too softly and the heater never fully wins against the winter cold. Inside, 8-year-old Ava Johnson stood on her tiptoes, clutching a few crumpled dollar bills in her small hands, her winter coat slightly too big and her shoes damp from walking 2 blocks in the drizzle. She studied the menu behind the counter like it was a difficult math problem, her breath faintly visible in the cold air that slipped in every time the door opened. The cashier watched her with a patient but tired expression, used to customers who came and went without much meaning attached to them. Ava finally pointed to the simplest sandwich on the menu. Turkey and cheese, nothing fancy, nothing extra, just warm enough to matter. When the cashier asked if she wanted chips or a drink, she hesitated, then shook her head, carefully placing her last $3 on the counter as if it were something fragile. Outside, on the edge of the sidewalk just beyond the deli's small awning, a man sat quietly on the cold concrete, his shoulders slightly hunched, his coat worn thin from too many seasons without replacement. He wasn't asking for anything, not holding a sign, not speaking to anyone passing by, just sitting there as if the world had slowly decided to walk past him instead of toward him. Ava noticed him earlier when she walked in, the way he kept looking at the window but never inside, as if he belonged to a moment that no longer had a place for him. Something about that silence stayed with her while she waited for her sandwich. When the cashier handed her the small paper bag, warm at the edges, Ava didn't immediately leave. She turned instead toward the door, her fingers tightening slightly around the bag's top fold. The bell above the door rang softly as she stepped out into the cold air, and for a moment she paused, watching the man. Again, his eyes briefly lifting toward her. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with time. Ava walked closer, slow and careful, as if afraid that sudden movement might break the fragile courage forming inside her chest. When she stopped in front of him, she held the sandwich out with both hands, her small voice almost swallowed by the wind as she said, "You looked hungry. I thought you might want this." The man didn't respond immediately. His gaze dropped to the sandwich, then back to her face, studying her as if trying to understand whether kindness was something he was still allowed to accept. Around them, people moved past without stopping, coats pulled tight, phones glowing in their hands, the city continuing its steady rhythm of indifference. Finally, the man spoke quietly, his voice low and cautious, as if unused to being part of conversations that weren't demands or questions. "You shouldn't waste food on someone like me," he said. Ava blinked once, not stepping back, not lowering her hands. "It's not wasted," she replied simply. "You need it more than I do right now." The words were not dramatic, not rehearsed, just a truth she carried without knowing its weight. For a brief moment, the man looked away, his jaw tightening slightly as something unspoken passed behind his eyes. Then slowly, carefully, he reached out and took the sandwich, holding it like it might disappear if he wasn't gentle enough. "What's your name?" he asked after a pause. "Ava," she said. "Ava Johnson." He repeated it under his breath, as if committing it to memory mattered more than anything else happening around them. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the paper bag in his hand, and Ava pulled her sleeves over her fingers, rocking back on her heels. "You should eat it while it's still warm," she added, then glanced back toward the deli, as if remembering she still had a place to return to. Before she turned away, the man spoke again, softer this time, almost uncertain. "Why did you do that?" Ava looked at him for a moment, then shrugged lightly, her answer carrying no expectation of reward or recognition. "Because you looked like nobody else was going to." And with that, she stepped back toward the door, disappearing inside the small warmth of the deli as the bell rang again above her head. The man remained outside, holding the sandwich in his hands, not opening it yet, just looking at it as the rain slowly softened around him. And for reasons he couldn't fully explain, something inside him shifted in a way he had not felt in a very long time. The man remained standing outside the deli long after Ava disappeared through the door, the warm glow of the small shop spilling faintly onto the wet sidewalk. Rain continued to fall in a slow, steady rhythm, softening the edges of the city into blurred lights and muted colors. He still held the sandwich in his hand, untouched, as if breaking it would somehow break the moment itself. People passed him without looking, umbrellas tilted forward, footsteps quick and indifferent, but he did not move. For a long time, he simply stared at the paper bag as though it carried more weight than its simple contents. Finally, he sat back down on the cold concrete step, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because sitting there felt easier than returning to wherever he had come from. He opened the bag slowly. The sandwich was simple, almost ordinary, the kind of food that most people would not think twice about. But as he took the first bite, something unfamiliar tightened quietly in his chest. It was not the taste, but the fact that someone had chosen to give it to him without expecting anything in return. He paused, looking down at the half-eaten food in his hand, then out toward the street where Ava had walked away. Inside the deli, Ava had already returned to her small world of routine. She sat near the window with her backpack on her lap, watching the rain gather in thin streams along the glass. Her mother worked long hours cleaning offices downtown, and Ava often waited for her here after school, doing homework or simply sitting quietly until it was time to walk home together. She pulled out a worn notebook and tried to focus on her writing assignment, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the man outside. There had been something about his silence that felt heavier than words, not dangerous, just distant, like someone standing at the edge of a long-forgotten memory. When her mother finally arrived nearly 20 minutes later, she was slightly out of breath, her coat damp from the rain. She smiled when she saw Ava, but there was fatigue in her eyes that she tried to hide. "Did you eat?" she asked gently, sitting down beside her. Ava nodded, not mentioning the sandwich she had given away. Instead, she closed her notebook and slipped it into her backpack. On the walk home, they passed the same corner where the man had been sitting, but he was gone now. Only a faint imprint remained on the wet concrete, quickly fading as more rain fell. Ava glanced at the empty space but said nothing, holding her mother's hand a little tighter as they crossed the street. Meanwhile, several blocks away, the man stood beneath the awning of an old building, watching the city move around him. He had changed position without thinking, his steps leading him instinctively away from the deli, but not toward anywhere in particular. In his mind, the moment kept replaying, not as something dramatic, but as something unsettlingly simple. A child had looked at him and decided he was still worth noticing. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folded receipt from earlier that day, one that had nothing important written on it, just a reminder of a meeting he had not attended. He let it go in the wind, watching it disappear into the rain. A passing taxi slowed briefly near the curb, its headlights reflecting off the wet pavement. And for a moment he considered getting in, going back to the version of his life that required no reflection. But instead, he remained where he was, leaning slightly against the wall, the sandwich now gone but the feeling it left behind still present. He did not yet know why the encounter unsettled him so deeply, only that it had disrupted something carefully balanced inside him. Far above the street, office lights flickered in tall buildings, and life continued its steady rhythm of transactions, schedules, and noise. Yet for him, something quieter had begun to form, something that did not fit easily into the structure of his days. He looked once more toward the direction of the deli, even though it was no longer visible, and whispered the name he had learned, not as a question, but as a reminder that it was real. Then he turned away, walking slowly into the rain, not toward who he had been, and not yet toward who he might become. The rain had softened into a thin mist by the time the man reached the edge of the downtown district, where the glow of streetlights reflected off wet asphalt like scattered fragments of glass. He moved slowly, not because he was tired, but because every step felt slightly misaligned with the version of himself he had been pretending to be for too long. The sandwich was gone, yet its presence lingered in a way that made him more aware of everything around him. The distant hum of traffic, the rhythm of footsteps passing him by, the cold air pressing gently against his skin. He stopped beneath an old bus stop shelter where the glass panels were slightly fogged, and for a long moment, he simply watched the city continue without him. His reflection stared back faintly, layered over the blurred lights, and he noticed how unfamiliar his own eyes looked, as if they belonged to someone who had stopped expecting anything from the world. In his coat pocket, his phone buzzed once, then again, but he did not answer. Instead, he pulled it out, looked at the screen, and turned it face down on the bench beside him. Across the city, Ava was already home, sitting at the small kitchen table while her mother heated a simple dinner on a small stove that clicked softly as it struggled against the draft from the window. The apartment was modest, with peeling paint near the corners and a radiator that only worked when it wanted to, but it was warm in the ways that mattered. Ava took off her damp shoes and placed them neatly by the door, her backpack resting beside her chair. Her mother asked her about her day, and Ava answered carefully, choosing ordinary words, leaving out the moment that still felt too delicate to explain. She said nothing about the man, nothing about the way he had looked at her, as if she had spoken a language he had almost forgotten. After dinner, Ava sat on her small bed and opened her notebook again, but her pencil hovered above the page without moving. Outside her window, the city lights flickered against the low clouds, and she found herself thinking again about the expression on the man's face when she had given him the sandwich. It had not been gratitude exactly, and not confusion either, but something quieter, like recognition of something long buried. She did not fully understand it, but she felt it mattered. Meanwhile, the man had begun walking again, this time without direction, drifting through streets that gradually became less crowded, the buildings lower, the light dimmer. Eventually, he reached a part of the city where old brick structures stood between vacant lots and small community buildings, one of them marked with a faded sign that read Harbor Outreach Center. He paused in front of it for several seconds, then pushed the door open. Inside, the air was warmer, filled with the faint smell of coffee and paper. A volunteer behind a counter looked up and offered a polite nod, not questioning his presence, simply pointing toward a seating area where a few people sat quietly. He chose a chair near the window, not joining anyone, just observing. On a nearby table, a stack of brochures described housing assistance, job placement, and temporary support programs. He did not reach for them, but he noticed them in a way he would have ignored before. A television mounted in the corner played muted local news, showing images of the city during the rain earlier that evening. He watched without sound, recognizing streets he had passed, people moving under umbrellas, moments that had already been forgotten by everyone else. His gaze lingered on the screen longer than intended, until a headline briefly flashed about rising economic gaps in the city's outer districts. He looked away, not because it disturbed him, but because it reminded him of something he had spent years avoiding acknowledging directly. After a while, he stood and walked to the small water station near the wall, filling a paper cup and drinking slowly. The volunteer glanced at him again, perhaps sensing he did not belong to the usual pattern of visitors, but said nothing. When he returned to his seat, he noticed a bulletin board near the exit filled with handwritten notes, job offers, and community messages. One note, slightly faded, had been pinned unevenly and read simply, "Kindness is not wasted here." He stared at it longer than expected, then turned away as if unsure why it unsettled him. Outside, the night had deepened, and the rain had fully stopped, leaving the streets shining under the city lights. He stepped back into the open air, pulling his coat tighter, and for the first time since the morning, he allowed himself to consider that the day had not been ordinary. Somewhere in the distance, a child's voice seemed to echo faintly in memory, not as sound, but as a reminder of something unfinished. He did not yet know what direction his life would take next, only that the path he had been walking before no longer felt like the only one available. The night had settled deeper over the city, wrapping streets and buildings in a quiet that felt heavier than darkness itself. The man stood outside the community center for a moment longer before finally stepping away, his hands buried in his coat pockets, his pace slower than before, as if the ground beneath him no longer carried the same certainty it once did. He walked without destination, passing closed storefronts with metal shutters pulled down, their surfaces reflecting distorted versions of streetlights like broken fragments of memory. His mind kept returning to the same small image, not the sandwich itself, but the moment it had been offered without hesitation, without calculation, without expectation. It followed him like a quiet echo he could not fully dismiss. Several blocks away, Ava was already asleep, her small room dimly lit by a night lamp that cast soft shapes across the walls. Her mother had finished another long shift, and sat quietly in the living room, folding laundry in silence, occasionally glancing toward the bedroom door with a tired but gentle expression. The apartment creaked faintly as the heater clicked on and off, struggling to maintain warmth against the cold outside. Ava's breathing was steady, her notebook left open on the desk beside a half-finished drawing of a city skyline she had imagined during the afternoon. In her sleep, she shifted slightly, unaware that the moment she had created earlier was already moving far beyond what she could see or understand. Back downtown, the man eventually stopped near a quiet intersection where the traffic lights changed even though no cars were waiting. He looked up at a tall building with dim office lights still glowing on one of the upper floors, and for the first time that night, he allowed himself to wonder what it would feel like to belong somewhere again, not as a visitor passing through, but as someone expected. His phone vibrated again, and this time he answered. A calm professional voice on the other end asked if he would be attending the scheduled meeting the next morning. He paused, looking at the empty street ahead of him, then replied in a tone that surprised even himself. Not tomorrow. There was a brief silence on the line, followed by a confirmation and polite acknowledgement, but he had already lowered the phone before the conversation fully ended. He slipped it back into his pocket and continued walking, now with no intention of returning to the rhythm that had defined his days before. Meanwhile, across town, the deli from earlier stood closed, its windows dark, the small bell inside resting silently above the door. The sidewalk where Ava had stood earlier was empty now, but the faint trace of her presence remained in the imagination of the man who had been there, as if the city itself had recorded something invisible in that brief exchange. He found himself turning in that direction without planning to, not because he expected to find anything, but because the memory of it pulled him like a thread he had not noticed until it tightened. When he arrived at the corner, he stopped again, looking at the storefront through the glass. His reflection appeared layered over the interior, and for a moment, he imagined the small figure standing there once more, holding out something simple and warm without asking for anything in return. The thought made him exhale slowly, as if releasing air he had been holding for years. A police patrol car passed slowly down the street, headlights sweeping across the pavement, briefly illuminating his face before moving on. No one stopped, no one questioned him, and yet he felt more visible in that moment than he had in any boardroom or office tower. He turned away from the deli and began walking again, this time more steadily, as if each step was aligning him with something he had not yet named. Far behind him, the city continued its quiet rhythm, unaware that something subtle had begun to shift within one of its most unremarkable nights. And somewhere in that same city, a child slept peacefully, carrying no awareness that a simple act of kindness had already begun to ripple outward in ways neither of them could yet see. The first light of morning arrived over the city slowly, as if even the sun was hesitant to interrupt the quiet tension left behind by the night. Streets that had been empty only hours earlier now carried the soft movement of early commuters, coffee shops unlocking their doors, and delivery trucks rolling through intersections with steady rhythm. In the middle of it all, the man stood outside a small public transit station, holding a paper cup of coffee he had bought but barely tasted. His coat was still slightly damp from the night air, and his expression carried a kind of calm that did not belong to his usual routine. He had not gone home. Instead, he had moved through the city until walking itself became less about escape and more about clarity. The world around him felt the same, but his perception of it had begun to shift in ways he could not fully explain. He checked his phone again, this time not for obligation, but out of habit shaped by a life he was slowly questioning. There were no urgent messages waiting for him, only scheduled reminders that suddenly felt distant, almost irrelevant. Across town, Ava was already awake, sitting at the edge of her bed with her feet resting on the cold floor, listening to the sound of her mother preparing breakfast in the small kitchen. The smell of toast filled the apartment, mixing with the faint scent of detergent from freshly washed clothes. Ava tied her shoes carefully, her movements quiet and practiced, preparing for another ordinary day that had not yet revealed anything unusual about itself. She did not mention the man from the previous day, not because she had forgotten, but because children often carry questions silently when they do not yet know how to ask them. Her mother reminded her to be careful on her way to school, and Ava nodded, stepping out into the hallway where the building lights flickered faintly before stabilizing. Meanwhile, the man had begun walking again, this time toward the financial district where tall buildings reflected the morning sky like polished glass. He moved against the flow of people in suits and briefcases, each of them absorbed in directions and deadlines that once defined his own life. When he reached the entrance of a large office tower, he stopped at the front steps, but did not go inside immediately. Instead, he looked up at the building, noticing for the first time how detached it felt from the street below, as if it existed in a separate layer of reality. A security guard at the entrance recognized him and greeted him with polite familiarity, but the man only nodded slightly and continued walking past the entrance instead of entering. The guard hesitated but said nothing, watching as he moved away from the revolving doors and toward a quieter side street. Inside the building, meetings had already begun, emails were being sent, and decisions were being made without him. But outside, he found himself drawn back toward the simpler parts of the city, where conversations were shorter and moments carried more visible weight. Eventually, he arrived at a small public park where a few early joggers moved along paved paths and a maintenance worker trimmed hedges near a bench. He sat down, placing the coffee cup beside him, untouched now, and leaned forward slightly with his elbows resting on his knees. The air was cool but comfortable, carrying the faint sound of leaves shifting in the breeze. As he sat there, his thoughts returned again to the girl, not as an image of poverty or circumstance, but as a moment of uncomplicated human choice. He realized he could not recall the last time someone had offered him something without expectation attached. The realization did not arrive with drama or shock, but with a quiet certainty that unsettled him more than any crisis would have. He remained there for a long time, watching the city continue to wake up around him, until his phone vibrated once more. This time, the call was from his assistant, informing him that a press briefing had been scheduled regarding his absence from a key morning meeting. He listened without interrupting, then replied calmly that the schedule would need to be adjusted indefinitely. There was confusion on the other end, followed by careful attempts to confirm his intention, but he only repeated the same answer, steady and clear. After ending the call, he placed the phone face down beside him and looked out across the park again. The sunlight had grown slightly stronger, touching the tops of nearby buildings and warming the concrete paths where people continued their routines unaware of the quiet decision that had just been made. In that moment, he did not yet know what he was moving toward, only that he could no longer continue exactly as he had before. And somewhere within the same city, a small girl walked toward school beneath the morning light, carrying nothing more than a backpack and the unspoken impact of a kindness she had never imagined would reach this far. The city had fully awakened now, its streets filled with the steady rhythm of movement, horns in the distance, and the low hum of conversations blending into one continuous sound. The man sat in the park longer than he intended, watching the way sunlight slowly replaced the shadows on the concrete paths. People passed by him without recognition, each absorbed in their own direction, their own urgency. For the first time in years, he did not feel pulled toward any of it. Instead, he felt suspended between what he had been and what he was not yet prepared to become. His phone remained face down beside him, silent after the last call, but the absence of constant interruption felt more powerful than any message could have been. Eventually, he stood and began walking again, not toward his office, not toward any scheduled obligation, but toward a direction that felt chosen rather than assigned. Across the city, Ava was seated in her classroom, sunlight streaming through tall windows and falling across rows of wooden desks. The teacher was speaking about reading comprehension, but Ava's attention drifted briefly toward the window, where clouds moved slowly across a pale blue sky. She rested her pencil against the edge of her notebook, her thoughts briefly returning to the man from the previous day, wondering if he had eaten the sandwich, wondering if he was still somewhere nearby, or if the moment had already dissolved into the vast noise of the city. She did not tell anyone about him, because it still felt like something too quiet to explain in words. At the front of the classroom, the teacher handed out a short writing exercise asking students to describe a moment when kindness changed something in their life. Ava looked down at the blank page in front of her and hesitated, her pencil hovering slightly above the paper. Meanwhile, the man had arrived near the edge of a different district, one where the buildings were older, the sidewalks narrower, and the energy of the city felt more grounded, less polished. He stopped in front of a small community board posted outside a public library, where notices were pinned unevenly and paper corners curled slightly from the wind. His eyes moved across the announcements without intention at first, until one simple flyer caught his attention. It was not extraordinary in appearance, just a handwritten notice about after-school support programs for children in the neighborhood, offering meals, tutoring, and safe spaces during late hours. He stood there for several minutes reading it repeatedly, as if trying to understand why something so ordinary held his attention more firmly than anything else had in days. Inside the library, a volunteer noticed him through the glass and approached politely, asking if he needed assistance. He hesitated before responding, then asked a simple question about whether the program was currently accepting volunteers or support. The volunteer smiled, slightly surprised, and confirmed that they always welcomed help from the community, especially during afternoons when children arrived after school. The man nodded slowly, taking in the information without committing to anything yet, but something in his expression had already begun to shift. As he left the library, he found himself walking in the direction of the neighborhood where the deli was located, though he had not consciously planned it. The streets became more familiar as he approached, until eventually he found himself standing once again in front of the same corner where the previous encounter had taken place. The deli was open now, its doors swinging gently as customers entered and exited, the bell above it ringing softly at intervals. He did not go inside immediately. Instead, he stood across the street, observing the flow of people, the normalcy of transactions, the way the world continued without awareness of individual moments that had altered him. Inside the deli, Ava's image lingered in his mind not as a memory fading, but as something increasingly present, as if it had settled into a part of his thinking he could no longer separate from his own decisions. He crossed the street slowly and entered the shop. The same bell rang above the door, and the warmth inside contrasted with the cool air outside. The cashier recognized him faintly but did not react strongly, assuming he was just another customer. He ordered nothing at first, simply standing near the counter, looking around as if searching for something that could not be placed on a menu. After a moment, he asked about the time when children typically came in after school, and the cashier mentioned late afternoon hours, when nearby schools ended classes. He nodded again, absorbing the rhythm of the place, then stepped back outside. The day continued its progression around him, but his attention remained anchored to a point that was no longer random. Far away, Ava finished her writing exercise, though her page remained mostly blank except for a single sentence she had managed to write at the top. She stared at it quietly, then closed her notebook as the bell signaled the end of the class period. As students gathered their belongings, she looked out the window once more, unaware that the choices unfolding across the city were already beginning to move closer toward her in ways she could not yet see. And in that same expanding city, the man walked slowly through the afternoon light, no longer following a path defined by habit, but by something quieter that had begun to take shape inside him, something that would eventually lead him back to where a simple act of kindness had first changed everything. The afternoon light had begun to soften across the city, stretching long shadows between buildings as the rhythm of daily life slowly shifted toward evening. Inside the public library on the corner of a quiet street, Ava sat at a long wooden table surrounded by other children who were finishing their assignments, the soft sound of turning pages filling the air like a gentle wave. She had not spoken much since arriving, her attention alternating between her unfinished writing and the faint memory of the man from the deli days earlier. The assignment still sat open in front of her, a single sentence written neatly at the top, describing a moment she could not fully explain but also could not forget. She tapped her pencil lightly against the paper, then looked up toward the tall windows where the sky was beginning to shift into warmer tones. Outside, the man stood across the street, watching the library entrance from a distance. He had returned there without fully planning to, as if his steps had gradually aligned themselves with a pattern he only now began to recognize. He did not enter immediately. Instead, he observed the flow of children leaving the building at the end of their programs, some walking alone, others accompanied by volunteers or parents. The sound of their voices carried faintly across the street, blending with the passing traffic and the distant hum of the city. After several minutes, he finally crossed the street and stepped inside. The warmth of the library greeted him quietly, a contrast to the cool air outside. The volunteer at the front desk looked up with polite curiosity as he approached, and he asked again about the after-school program he had seen earlier. This time his questions were more specific, less hesitant, as if something inside him had already begun to commit before his words fully caught up. The volunteer explained that the program was designed to support children who needed a safe place after school hours, offering tutoring, meals, and guidance until evening. The man listened carefully, nodding at intervals, then asked if they ever needed consistent help from someone who could contribute more than occasional assistance. The volunteer paused briefly, then smiled and said they always needed people who were willing to show up regularly, especially those who understood responsibility in a deeper sense. Those words stayed with him longer than expected. He thanked the volunteer and walked slowly through the aisles of books, his eyes moving across shelves without focusing on any single title. Eventually, he found himself near the children's reading section, where small chairs and colorful rugs created a space that felt separate from the rest of the building. He stood there quietly, noticing how different this environment felt from the offices and boardrooms he had spent most of his life in. There was no urgency here, no pressure to decide anything immediately, only a steady sense of presence. Across the room, a group of children were reading together with a volunteer, their voices soft but animated as they discussed a story. The man watched them for a moment, then looked away as if unsure whether he had the right to remain in that space for too long. Meanwhile, Ava had finished her assignment and was preparing to leave the library with her mother, who had arrived after work. As they stepped outside into the evening air, Ava paused briefly at the entrance, glancing across the street without realizing why. The man was no longer visible, but something about the moment made her linger for a second longer than usual before continuing on her way. Her mother noticed, but did not ask questions, simply adjusting her bag and guiding her gently toward the sidewalk. The city had begun its transition into evening, streetlights flickering on one by one as the sun lowered further behind the skyline. Inside the library, the man remained for a while longer, eventually speaking with a program coordinator who explained the schedule and expectations for volunteers. He did not make a formal commitment that day, but he requested the necessary information and asked for a form to be sent to him. The coordinator handed it over without surprise, accustomed to people arriving at different stages of intention. As he left the building, he folded the paper carefully and placed it inside his coat pocket, not as a final decision, but as something that now had weight beyond its physical form. Outside, the air was cooler again, and the streetlights reflected off the pavement in soft golden lines. He stood for a moment on the steps of the library, looking out at the quiet movement of the neighborhood. Children had already gone home, the streets less crowded than earlier in the day, but the sense of life remained in subtle forms, in windows lit with dinner preparation, in distant conversations, in the steady passing of cars. He began walking again, this time not away from anything in particular, but toward the possibility that had begun forming quietly within him since the first moment he accepted a sandwich from a stranger. And somewhere in that same city, a small girl walked beside her mother, unaware that the simple act she had chosen without expectation was already continuing to reshape the path of someone she would never have expected to matter beyond a single afternoon. The evening had fully settled over the city, bringing with it a quieter rhythm that softened even the busiest streets into something more reflective. Streetlights glowed warmly against the cooling air, and the flow of people shifted from urgency to something slower, more human. Inside a modest community center not far from the library, chairs were being arranged in small clusters, backpacks lined up neatly along the wall, and the faint smell of warm food drifted from a small kitchen in the back. The man stood just outside the entrance for a moment before stepping in, holding the folded volunteer form in his hand as if it carried more weight than paper should. He was dressed simply, no longer in the sharp attire of meetings or offices, but in something quieter that did not announce who he used to be. The coordinator from the library greeted him and guided him inside, explaining that the after-school program was already in progress for the day, with children arriving in waves depending on their school schedules. He listened carefully, observing the space as he walked through it. It was not grand or polished, but it was alive in a way that felt immediate and real, filled with the sound of small conversations, laughter, and the occasional scrape of chairs against the floor. He was assigned to assist with reading time, a simple role that required nothing more than presence and patience. As he moved toward the designated area, he noticed children already gathering in a semicircle around a volunteer who was reading aloud from a worn storybook. The man took a seat slightly off to the side, not immediately drawing attention, allowing himself to simply observe. The children varied in age, some leaning forward with curiosity, others resting their chins on their hands as they listened. Among them, Ava sat quietly near the center, her small backpack placed neatly beside her, her eyes focused on the book but occasionally drifting toward the new volunteer she had not seen before. There was something about his stillness that felt familiar, though she could not place it. The man noticed her only after a few moments, not because she stood out in appearance, but because of the same quiet attentiveness he remembered from before. She was not restless like some of the other children, but present in a way that suggested she was absorbing more than she showed. Their eyes briefly met across the room, but neither reacted beyond a simple acknowledgement, as if both were unsure whether recognition had any place here. The reading session continued, and the man eventually joined in, helping a few children sound out difficult words, his voice calm and measured, adjusting to the rhythm of the group. He found himself surprised by how natural it felt, not as an obligation, but as something closer to participation in a shared moment rather than direction from above. Ava listened quietly as he read, her attention occasionally shifting between the story and the tone of his voice, which carried a steadiness she had not expected from someone new. When the session ended, the children were guided toward a snack table, and the room filled with softer movement, wrappers being opened, quiet conversations forming in small clusters. Ava remained seated for a moment longer, watching the man as he helped another child find a book from a nearby shelf. There was no sense of distance in the way he interacted, no visible separation between him and the space, only a quiet willingness to be present without instruction. The coordinator approached him briefly, checking if he was comfortable continuing with the program, and he simply nodded, saying he would return the next day. Ava overheard the exchange but did not comment, instead turning her attention back to her notebook, where she had begun writing again, this time adding more sentences than she had the day before. As the evening progressed and parents began arriving to pick up their children, the room gradually emptied, leaving behind the faint traces of activity that lingered in the arrangement of chairs and the soft echo of voices. The man stood near the entrance, watching as each child left with their family, observing the way hands reached for hands, the way small figures disappeared into larger ones at the door. When Ava finally left, she walked past him without stopping, but for a brief moment, her pace slowed, as if something in her noticed something familiar without fully understanding why. Her mother thanked the volunteers quietly as they exited, and the two of them stepped into the evening air, blending into the flow of the city once more. The man remained inside for a few minutes after everyone had gone, helping to stack chairs and clean the tables without being asked. The coordinator thanked him again, surprised at how quickly he had adapted to the rhythm of the space. He responded simply, without elaboration, then stepped back outside. The night had deepened slightly, and the city lights now reflected more clearly on the pavement, creating long lines of gold and white stretching into the distance. He stood at the edge of the sidewalk for a moment, looking in the direction where Ava had gone, though she was no longer visible. He did not follow, but he did not turn away either. Instead, he remained still, as if acknowledging that something had begun to take shape through repetition rather than intention. Somewhere within the quiet spaces between buildings and conversations, a connection that neither of them fully understood was continuing to form, not through words or declarations, but through the simple act of showing up in the same places at different times without knowing yet that their paths were slowly aligning. The city had fully transitioned into night again, but this time it felt different from the nights before, as if something unseen had quietly settled into its rhythm. Streetlights reflected off the pavement in long golden streaks, and the air carried a calm stillness that softened even the usual noise of traffic. Inside the community center, most of the lights had been turned off, leaving only a few warm lamps glowing near the entrance where volunteers prepared to close for the evening. The man stood near the doorway, finishing the last small task of stacking chairs, his movements unhurried and precise, as if he was learning how to exist inside this space rather than simply passing through it. The coordinator thanked him again, mentioning that consistency mattered more than perfection, and he nodded without responding immediately, absorbing the meaning behind the words rather than the words themselves. When he finally stepped outside, the cool night air greeted him gently, and he paused on the steps for a moment before descending to the sidewalk. Across the street, the city continued its quiet movement, headlights passing in steady intervals, pedestrians walking with lowered voices, the distant sound of a train echoing faintly through the buildings. He checked the time on his phone without urgency, then placed it back into his pocket, choosing instead to simply walk. Meanwhile, not far away, Ava had already returned home and was sitting at her small desk by the window, her mother moving quietly through the apartment as she prepared for the next morning. The room was warm in contrast to the cold outside, and a small lamp illuminated the space where Ava worked on her school assignment, now filled with more sentences than before. She paused occasionally, tapping her pencil against the edge of the desk, her thoughts drifting between her writing and the memory of the community center, where the new volunteer had quietly blended into the rhythm of the room without needing attention. She did not fully understand why she remembered him more clearly than others, only that his presence had felt steady, like something that did not interrupt but remained. Outside her window, the city lights flickered gently, and she leaned slightly forward, resting her chin on her hand as she continued writing. At the same time, the man had begun walking through quieter streets that led away from the brighter districts and toward the neighborhoods where life moved at a slower, more grounded pace. He passed small grocery stores closing for the night, a bus stop where a few people waited in silence, and an intersection where a street musician packed away his instrument after finishing a short performance for no audience in particular. He stopped briefly near a corner where a bulletin board displayed community notices, his eyes scanning the pages without urgency. One flyer repeated information about the after-school program, its simple design unchanged from before, and he studied it for a moment longer than necessary. The decision he had been moving toward over the past days no longer felt abstract or uncertain, but increasingly natural, as if it had been forming quietly beneath every step he had taken since that first encounter. He continued walking until he reached a bridge overlooking a slow-moving river that reflected the city lights in broken lines of silver and gold. He leaned slightly against the railing, looking down at the water as it moved steadily beneath him, indifferent to observation or meaning. For a long time, he remained there, not thinking about schedules or responsibilities, but about presence, about how moments that seemed small could accumulate into something that changed direction without warning. In another part of the city, Ava finished her assignment and closed her notebook, placing it carefully inside her backpack. Her mother reminded her it was late, and Ava nodded, turning off the small desk lamp before getting ready for bed. As she lay down, she stared at the ceiling for a few seconds, then closed her eyes, drifting into sleep with no awareness of how her simple choices had already begun to extend beyond her understanding. Back at the bridge, the man finally turned away from the railing, his decision now no longer forming but established. He walked back toward the direction of the community center, not because he was required to, but because it felt like the only place in the city where something had begun that he could not ignore. The streets were quieter now, and each step carried a sense of continuity rather than departure. As he moved through the night, the distance between who he had been and who he was becoming no longer felt like two separate places, but like a single path gradually unfolding under steady light. And somewhere within the same city, a small girl slept peacefully, unaware that the quiet consistency of her kindness had already begun to shape the return of someone she had once seen only as a stranger passing through.